The avoidant has an entire mental blueprint for how people respond to their withdrawal. They've seen it play out countless times across relationships, friendships, family dynamics. When they pull away, people pursue. When they create distance, others close it. When they go silent, people fill that silence with messages, questions, pleas for connection. This pattern has been so consistent throughout their life that it became predictive, something they could count on. The avoidant built their entire relational strategy around this certainty. No matter how unavailable they became, someone would always be there doing the work of maintaining the connection. They could be passive, distant, inconsistent, and the relationship would continue because the other person would compensate for their lack of effort. But you broke the pattern. You chose silence. And the avoidant is experiencing a level of psychological shock they have no framework for processing, because the one thing they were absolutely certain would never happen has happened. You stopped trying. The avoidant's entire sense of relational safety was built on being able to control intimacy through withdrawal. They could get close when they wanted closeness, then retreat when vulnerability became overwhelming, secure in the knowledge that the other person would hold the connection steady during their absence. This dynamic allowed them to experience relationship benefits without relationship risks, connection without genuine vulnerability, intimacy on their terms, without the terror of actual dependence. But this entire system required your participation. It required you to keep reaching out, keep initiating, keep caring enough to bridge every gap they created. Your silence has dismantled the machinery that allowed their avoidance to function without consequence. What the avoidant never understood, never even considered, was that silence could be a choice rather than a punishment. In their psychology, silence from them meant self-protection and boundary setting. But silence from others meant anger, manipulation, passive aggression. They never conceived that someone could choose silence not to hurt them or control them, but simply to stop participating in a dynamic that was causing harm. Your silence isn't a strategy to make them chase you. It's not a game to make them miss you. It's not even necessarily about them at all. It's about you choosing yourself, protecting your peace, refusing to continue patterns that were destroying your sense of self-worth. But the avoidant can't comprehend this kind of silence because it exists outside their entire understanding of how relationships work. The entitlement they didn't know they had. The avoidant is confronting a form of entitlement so deeply embedded in their psychology that they never recognized it as entitlement at all. They believed they were entitled to your continued pursuit regardless of how they treated you. They thought you would always be available as an option, always willing to try again, always ready to accept whatever scraps of attention they felt comfortable offering. This wasn't conscious arrogance. It was unconscious assumption built from years of people proving through their behavior that the avoidant could be inconsistent, unavailable, even cruel, and still be pursued. This entitlement manifested in how casually the avoidant treated your efforts. Every time you reached out after they'd gone silent, every time you initiated plans after they'd cancelled, every time you were vulnerable after they'd been cold, you were teaching them that their behavior had no real consequences. You were demonstrating that no matter what they did or didn't do, you would still be there. The avoidant absorbed this lesson completely. They came to expect your pursuit as a given, as reliable as gravity. They planned their entire relational approach around the certainty of your continued effort. The entitlement also showed up in how they responded to your needs. When you asked for consistency, they felt imposed upon. When you expressed hurt about their unavailability, they felt criticized. When you wanted clarity about the relationship, they felt pressured. They experienced your completely reasonable needs as unreasonable demands because they felt entitled to have connection entirely on their terms. They wanted you available when they wanted you, understanding when they disappeared, patient with their limitations, but they never considered that you might have limits too, that your patience might have an expiration date, that their behavior was asking you to betray yourself repeatedly. Now your silence is forcing the avoidant to see this entitlement clearly, and the recognition is deeply uncomfortable. They took you for granted not because you weren't valuable, but because they assumed your value would always be available to them, regardless of how they treated that value. They mistook your patience for permanence, your understanding for unlimited tolerance, your love for something that could survive infinite neglect. The shock they're experiencing isn't just about missing you. It's about the shattering of their fundamental assumption that they could have you without earning you, keep you without maintaining the relationship, benefit from your presence without reciprocating your effort. The miscalculation of your attachment. The avoidant catastrophically miscalculated the nature of your attachment to them. They saw your pursuit and interpreted it as need, as dependency, as proof that you couldn't live without them. This interpretation made them feel safe. If you needed them desperately, you wouldn't leave. If you were deeply attached, they could be inconsistent without real risk. If you loved them enough to tolerate their unavailability, they could maintain their comfortable distance indefinitely. But they confused your capacity to love with inability to leave. They mistook your willingness to be patient with inability to choose yourself. What the avoidant failed to understand is that the people who pursue hardest are often the people with the deepest capacity for self-respect, once they recognize they're pursuing someone who won't meet them halfway. Your pursuit wasn't weakness, it was generosity. It was you giving them opportunity after opportunity to show up differently. It was you hoping that your patience would help them feel safe enough to be vulnerable. But patience deployed toward someone who exploits rather than appreciates it eventually transforms into wisdom. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you started caring about yourself more than you cared about potential that was never actualizing. The avoidant also misjudged the depth of the pain they were causing you. They saw your hurt but minimized it, told themselves you were being too sensitive or too demanding. They didn't understand that every time they withdrew without explanation, every instance they were cold after you'd been warm, every moment they made you feel like you were too much, they were making deposits in a bank account of pain that would eventually reach capacity. Your silence isn't sudden. It's the result of accumulated hurt reaching a breaking point where continuing to pursue them would mean abandoning yourself entirely. The miscalculation was also about the nature of your strength. The avoidant saw you trying, saw you reaching out, saw you hoping, and they interpreted all of it as evidence that you were the weaker one in the dynamic. But it takes tremendous strength to keep trying with someone who doesn't reciprocate. It takes courage to be vulnerable with someone who responds to vulnerability with distance. The real weakness was always theirs, the inability to show up, the fear that controlled their behavior, the emotional cowardice that masqueraded as independence. Your silence is revealing who was actually strong all along. The identity crisis your silence triggers. The avoidant's entire identity is organized around being the person who doesn't need anyone, who can take or leave relationships, who remains unbothered and unaffected. This identity is propped up by being the one who creates distance, the one who ends things, the one who has the power to leave. But your silence has stripped them of this identity in one devastating move. You left. You ended it through your disengagement. You demonstrated that you don't need them. The identity the avoidant has spent their life constructing is crumbling, because you've proven through your silence that you're actually the one who doesn't need this connection to survive. This identity crisis manifests as profound confusion about who they are if they're not the person who cares less. The avoidant has always defined themselves in opposition to need, in contrast to dependency, as fundamentally different from people who get attached and hurt when relationships end, but they're hurt now. They're experiencing the exact kind of pain they've always judged as weakness in others. They're feeling attached, dependent, desperate for contact from someone who isn't providing it. Every feeling they're experiencing contradicts who they believe they are, and the cognitive dissonance is creating psychological chaos. The avoidant is also confronting the possibility that their entire identity was performance rather than truth. They weren't actually unbothered by people leaving. They just never let people get close enough that their leaving would hurt. They weren't actually independent. They just maintained relationships where the other person did all the work of connection while they performed aloofness. They weren't actually strong. They were just protected by being the person who cared less in dynamics where the other person cared desperately. Your silence has exposed that without someone pursuing them, without someone doing the emotional labor, without someone caring more. Their supposed strength reveals itself as nothing but defended fear. The crisis extends to their narrative about what kind of person they are in relationships. The avoidant has always told themselves they're honest about their limitations, that they never promise more than they can deliver, that people who get hurt by them simply had unrealistic expectations. But your silence is forcing them to question this narrative. Maybe they weren't honest, maybe their actions contradicted their words constantly, maybe they gave you just enough to keep you hoping while never actually following through. Maybe they led you on not through explicit promises, but through intermittent reinforcement that kept you invested in potential that was never going to actualize. The powerlessness they've never experienced. The avoidant is drowning in a specific form of powerlessness they've structured their entire life to avoid. They have no power over your silence. They can't control it, can't manipulate it, can't withdraw from it, because they're already the ones being withdrawn from. Every strategy they've ever used to manage relational anxiety is useless, because all those strategies involve creating distance, and you've created all the distance already. They're completely stripped of their primary coping mechanism, and the resulting powerlessness is activating every wound they've spent their life protecting. This powerlessness is particularly unbearable because it forces the avoidant to sit in feelings they've always escaped through withdrawal. They can't run from the discomfort of wanting you because running is what created this situation. They can't create space to regulate their anxiety because space is what they have in abundance and it's not helping. They can't minimize the importance of the relationship because the intensity of their reaction to your silence proves it was important all along. They're trapped in emotional experience with no exit, forced to feel everything they've spent decades avoiding. The powerlessness also means the avoidant has to experience genuine uncertainty about outcome, something they've managed to avoid throughout their relational life. When they were the ones creating distance, they controlled whether reconnection happened. They could reach back out when they were ready, and typically you would respond. But now they don't control if reconnection happens. That's entirely in your hands. They might reach out and you might not respond. Or worse, you might respond with polite distance that makes clear the door is closed. They're in the terrifying position of wanting something they can't control, needing something they can't guarantee, hoping for something that might not happen regardless of what they do. The avoidant is also powerless to undo the past, and this realization is hitting them with particular force. They can't take back the times they were cold, the opportunities they wasted, the hurt they caused. They can't replay the relationship and make different choices. They're stuck with the consequences of their behavior, and consequences without the possibility of revision create a specific kind of suffering the avoidant has never experienced. They've always been able to walk away from relationship wreckage without looking back, but they can't walk away from this because you're the one who walked away first, and their feet are stuck in the rubble of what they destroyed. The realization that silence is self-respect. One of the most psychologically destabilizing aspects of your silence is what it reveals about your relationship with yourself. The avoidant is slowly realizing that your silence isn't about them at all. Not really. It's about you choosing self-respect over hope, boundaries over potential, peace over the chaos their inconsistency created. This realization is devastating because it means they've lost you not to another person or to circumstances, but to your own growth, to your decision that you deserve better than what they were offering. Your silence is the sound of you valuing yourself enough to walk away from someone who couldn't value you properly. It's the evidence of boundaries the avoidant never thought you'd enforce. It's the proof that you have limits, that your patience wasn't infinite, that your love for them couldn't override your love for yourself indefinitely. The avoidant always believed that if they just maintained minimal contact, if they offered occasional warmth between long stretches of cold, you would stay. They thought your attachment to them was stronger than your attachment to your own well-being. Your silence proves they were wrong. This realization forces the avoidant to see you differently. They always saw you as someone who needed them, who would tolerate their behavior because you didn't think you could do better. But your silence reveals someone with enough self-worth to refuse mistreatment, with enough clarity to recognize patterns that weren't serving you, with enough courage to leave even though you still had feelings. The avoidant is seeing you now as you actually are, someone strong enough to love them and strong enough to stop when that love wasn't returned adequately. This revised vision of you makes the loss even more painful because they're recognizing the value of what they've lost precisely because you valued yourself enough to leave. The avoidant is also confronting what your silence says about their treatment of you. If your silence is self-respect, then their behavior was disrespectful. If your silence is self-protection, then their behavior was harmful. If your silence is a boundary, then their behavior was a violation. They can no longer hide behind the narrative that they were just being honest about their limitations or protecting their own boundaries. Your silence is holding up a mirror that shows them they were someone who took advantage of another person's patience, who exploited someone's willingness to work with their limitations, who caused genuine harm while telling themselves they were being appropriately boundaried. The regret that changes nothing. The avoidant is experiencing comprehensive regret that's tearing through every defense they've ever constructed. They regret taking you for granted. They regret every time they chose comfort over courage. They regret not communicating what was really happening for them. They regret the coldness, the distance, the casual cruelty of their inconsistency. They regret not appreciating what you offered while you were still offering it. The regret is all-consuming, touching every memory, recontextualizing every interaction, showing them in brutal detail what they had and what they destroyed through their fear. But the tragedy of this regret is that it changes nothing. The avoidant is learning one of life's cruelest lessons. Some damage can't be undone. Some opportunities don't come again. Some people won't give you another chance no matter how much you've grown or how deeply you regret. Your silence is final in ways that their withdrawal never was. When they went silent, you waited, hoped, gave them space to come back. But when you went silent, it was an ending, not a pause. They're experiencing regret in the past tense, mourning what was while you've already moved into what's next. The regret is also complicated by the awareness that even if you gave them another chance, they're not sure they're actually capable of being different. The avoidant hasn't done the deep work of addressing their attachment wounds. They haven't built capacity for sustained vulnerability. They haven't developed skills for staying present when intimacy feels overwhelming. They're feeling intense regret and desperate desire to try again, but these feelings are arising from loss, not from genuine readiness for intimacy. They want you back because you're gone, not because they've become someone who can actually keep you. The avoidant is also experiencing the specific torture of regret that includes self-awareness. They can see exactly how their behavior pushed you away. They can identify every moment they chose wrong. They can articulate what they should have done differently. But this clarity is arriving too late. It's the punishment of understanding after the fact, of getting the lesson only after failing the test completely. They're finally seeing everything clearly now, that there's nothing left to see except the wreckage of what they destroyed, the bargaining with silence. The avoidant is engaging in desperate internal bargaining that reveals just how profoundly your silence has destabilized them. They're making deals with the universe, with fate, with themselves. If you would just reach out one more time, they'd respond differently. If you would just give them another chance, they'd prove they can change. If you would just break your silence, they'd never take you for granted again. These bargains are irrational and impossible to fulfill, but the avoidant is grasping at anything that might restore the connection they didn't appreciate until it was gone. This bargaining includes obsessive mental scenarios, where they imagine reaching out to you and you responding positively. They rehearse conversations where they finally say everything they couldn't say before. They construct fantasies where their vulnerability is met with your willingness to try again. They imagine proving through actions that they've changed, that they understand, that they're ready for real intimacy now. These fantasies provide temporary relief from the pain of your silence, but they also deepen that pain because the gap between fantasy and reality is so vast. The avoidant is also bargaining with themselves about what your silence means. Maybe you just need more time. Maybe you're waiting for them to make the first move. Maybe your silence is a test they need to pass. Maybe if they give you space, you'll come back on your own. These interpretations allow them to maintain hope while avoiding the terrifying possibility that your silence is exactly what it appears to be: a permanent withdrawal of your energy from a connection that was costing you too much. The permanent shift your silence creates. Whether or not you ever speak to the avoidant again, your silence has created permanent psychological shifts they can't reverse. They will never again be able to assume that people will pursue them indefinitely, regardless of how they behave. They will never again be able to take someone's effort for granted without some awareness that effort can be withdrawn. They will never again be able to maintain their illusion that their unavailability is consequence-free. Your silence has educated them in ways that confrontation never could, through the lived experience of losing something important because they couldn't show up for it adequately. This permanent shift includes the knowledge that silence can be powerful. The avoidant always believed power came from being able to withdraw, from being the one who cared less, from being the one who could leave. But your silence has taught them that real power is being able to leave, actually doing it, choosing yourself even when you still have feelings. You demonstrated a form of power they didn't know existed. The power of self-respect, of boundaries enforced not through anger but through quiet departure, of love that includes yourself enough to walk away from people who can't love you properly. The shift also includes the undeniable evidence that the avoidance patterns have real costs. They've always been able to tell themselves that their avoidance was just their attachment style, something others needed to accept or accommodate. But your silence proves that their attachment style has consequences, that other people have breaking points, that you can't treat people poorly indefinitely and expect them to stay. This knowledge is now part of them, whether they use it to change or to become more defended. Either way, they can never fully return to the unconscious certainty they had before you chose silence. The avoidant is also permanently marked by the specific pain of being on the receiving end of the distance they create. They've experienced what it feels like to want contact that doesn't come, to wonder if they matter, to sit in uncertainty about where they stand. This embodied knowledge of the pain their behavior causes is something they'll carry forward. They might suppress it, minimize it, defend against it, but it's there. They know now what their withdrawal feels like from the other side, and that knowledge changes them even if they pretend it doesn't. The question of whether they learn. The ultimate question is whether your silence will teach the avoidant anything, or simply confirm their worst beliefs about relationships. Some avoidants will use this experience as the wake-up call they needed. They'll finally seek real help, do the deep therapeutic work of addressing their attachment wounds, develop capacity for vulnerability they've never had. They'll recognize that your silence was gift, even though it felt like punishment. The gift of consequences that might finally motivate change. They'll become people capable of the intimacy they couldn't offer you, though that capacity will come too late to benefit the relationship with you. But other avoidants will use your silence as confirmation that people leave, that vulnerability leads to pain, that their initial instinct to keep people at distance was correct all along. They'll harden rather than soften. They'll become more defended rather than more open. They'll tell themselves that your silence proves relationships aren't worth the risk, that people are unreliable, that their avoidance was protective wisdom rather than fearful limitation. They'll carry you as evidence that caring leads to suffering, using your memory to justify never letting anyone close again. The direction they go depends on factors you can't control. It depends on their willingness to sit in discomfort long enough to learn from it. It depends on whether they have support systems that encourage growth rather than validate defense. It depends on their capacity for honesty with themselves about their own role in relationship failures. It depends on whether they can tolerate the ego death that real transformation requires. You've created the condition for potential growth through your silence. But whether they grow is entirely up to them. What's certain is that they didn't think you'd choose silence. They didn't plan for it, didn't prepare for it, didn't believe it was possible. They thought your pursuit was guaranteed, thought your patience was infinite, thought their behavior had no real consequences because you would always be there to absorb the impact. Your silence shattered every one of these assumptions, and the avoidant is reeling from the shock of a world where people who love them can also leave them, where care has limits, where their patterns cost them something irreplaceable. They're learning the hardest lesson of their life. Silence is an answer, and sometimes it's the only answer someone who truly values themselves can give.